All right. Can you guys hear me okay? Louder?
Oh, you have a microphone.
I have this.
That's only connected to the camera.
That's all it is. All right.
You may want to sit closer.
Yeah, why don't people move up? It's more intimate anyway.
Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to start with the program, and then maybe a few minutes after everybody talks, in the middle of Q&A, we'll have some announcements for upcoming sessions. We also have do we have a video as well?
Yes, we have video.
Okay. Well, all right. We have a few announcements to give, but let's start with the program. We have 4 scholars, and there's really no other word to use. They are scholars, and we're so fortunate to have them. And our topic today is capturing the complexity of Judaism and Islam, theology, culture, institutions, and other. So first, we will hear from our Jewish speakers, based on the idea that Judaism came first, and despite the fact that usually you give the older sibling the choice as to whether to defer to the second half or to accept the kickoff in the first half. But we're going to do the Jews first, okay? Because we're not paying attention to football on Sunday afternoons. Our first speaker is Gideon Amir. Gideon is the child of Holocaust survivors and a former Israeli Defense Forces paratrooper. In Beersheba, he founded and ran a college computer science department. And more recently, he received his master's degree in Jewish studies. Gideon teaches the Bible at various adult education classes in the Washington area and Baltimore, I believe, including at synagogues and at churches. And he's a real go-to person when you have questions about all facets of Judaism.
Thank you. So I will leave the complexity to Ira to speak about, and I'm going to talk. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the contribution of early Judaism that evolved in biblical time up to the beginning of the Common Era, and I'm going to focus on few points that I believe that it's really the major contribution of Judaism to society and to culture. Of course, we have to start with the idea of monotheism, just the idea of the belief in one God, as opposed to polytheism, the belief in many gods. Now, to be honest, Judaism was not the only, or the Hebrews, if you want, are not the only ones who believed in one God. We have other occasions in history where others also came up with the same kind of a conclusion. One of the most famous one is in around 1300 before the Common Era. There was an Egyptian king, Akhenaton, depends how you pronounce it. He introduced, during his reign, he introduced the idea that the only real God is the God of the sun, out of the many gods that the Egyptians had. However, what happened was that when he died around 1336 or something like this, before the Common Era, the country reverted back to polytheism. So the idea did not catch on, yes? So what we do have is the biblical story and the Bible that was developed around that kind of an idea that eventually affected the West, at least Western cultures, but not only Western cultures as of today. Now, Abraham is many times called the father of monotheism because of that, because there are these followers that continue throughout history until today. But for me, what is so interesting is that the Bible actually does not preach monotheism. When I say Bible, I mean the Hebrew Bible, not the New Testament, just the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Not only the 5 books, the whole Tanakh, the whole Hebrew Bible. Yes, there are about 3 or 4 places in Deuteronomy where there is a statement that is made, there is no other but God. There is no other but the God of the Bible. And I think Jeremiah says it one time, and Isaiah maybe say it one time. So altogether we have less than 10 places in the Bible where the actual idea of monotheism, that means that there is only one God, is actually there. What the Bible really believed is in something else that is called monolatrism, which means there is an acknowledgement that there are many gods, but we worship only one God. We choose one God out of the many, and this is the one that we worship. And this is established already, for example, in the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments start, I am the Lord your God, you shall not have other gods beside me. It does not say, I am the Lord your God, there are no other gods besides me. It's only said, you who enter into a covenant with me, you are not going to worship other gods. Okay? And there is an acknowledgement that there are other gods, and sometimes in the Bible we actually see competition between the God of Israel and other gods. For example, the whole story of the Exodus is a clear demonstration where the God of Israel has to demonstrate that he is stronger and greater than the God of the Egyptians, and therefore it takes such a long time. It takes 10 plagues. At the beginning, every miracle that Moses is making, the Egyptian magicians can also perform. Later on, with the help of God, there are magics that they cannot do, yes, because the God of Israel is stronger and greater. The actual monotheism, that means the actual idea not only that we worship this one God because of the covenant, but that there are no other gods, really is actually really post-biblical. But of course it is affected by the Bible. It is affected by the story of Abraham and the rest of the stories that are coming. So we come to monotheism, pure monotheism, really only around the time of Jesus. Around that time, when Judaism and then Christianity, when it diverged from Judaism, established the idea that this is a one God, and the pagan world was also ready to change from the idea of many gods to the idea that there is only one God. But so this is really a contribution from the Bible, even though the Bible itself, we think mistakenly that the Bible promotes it, but actually it doesn't. It actually comes later as a responsibility from the Bible. There is another major contribution that is definitely coming from the Bible, and I think that is very, very important. And that is the idea that God gave us all the commandments, how we are supposed to live our life. And the commandments include, there is a chunk of the commandments that say how you worship God, especially during the time that sacrifices still existed, yes, what sacrifice you do in the morning, what sacrifice you do in the evening, in holidays, also all things like this. That means how to worship God properly is clearly established, especially in the book of Leviticus. But there are many other commandments that teach us how we are supposed to live our life. Talk about morality, talk about justice, talk about no cheating, not to have false measurements and all sorts of things like this. Talk about the kind of consequences that society has to give to people who are breaking the laws and everything like that. Now, many of these laws were the laws of the land at the time, and many of the laws can be found in other places. For example, in the laws of Hammurabi. that we actually have, yes, in writing on stone that were found in Babylon. But the difference and the ingenuity and the revolutionary idea that the Bible gives us is the idea that following the laws, the moral laws of our behavior between one another are part of the worship of God. That means if I do the right thing, and if I don't cheat in business, and if I do the right thing, and I act compassionately towards the widow and the orphan and so forth, this is in part of the worship of God. This is not just that this is the law of the land, part of it is the worship of God. And we see it very interestingly as we go along the books. At the early books, the sins, and whenever it says that the Israelites sinned, the sin was that they went and worshipped other gods. That was the focus. As you move through the books, and you come, especially when you come to the great prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and like that, Amos, you discover that the sin has nothing to do with the worship of God. It has to do with acting in an immoral way and not following the laws of morality that were given. That is a sin, and that is blaspheming God. So Judaism introduced, if you want, the idea, for example, that if I cheat in business, I'm actually doing something against God, not only against another human being. That idea, of course, was taken later on into Christianity and into Islam, yes? But this is the impetus for this idea came from the Bible. As a matter of fact, as the laws of Judaism have developed, the Jewish system became such that every action of life, from the morning that we wake up till the time that we go to sleep, every action that we do has sort of first of all, has sort of clear reference on how to do it, and second, has a religious meaning. We don't see it so much today because as we moved from Orthodox Judaism also to other branches like conservative, like Reform and so forth, people adhere less to all these things. But an Orthodox Jew, for example, when he wakes up, he knows exactly what kind of blessing he has to say, thanking God for returning his soul into him, because while we are asleep, the soul goes and charges its batteries someplace, yes? And when we wake up, the soul enters. So you say thank you to God for waking up. An Orthodox Jew knows, for example, which shoe he has to put on first, the right shoe or the left shoe. I honestly don't know the answer, but I know that there is an answer to that question. That means that every act of during the day, every act of life, has a religious connotation, and it allows you on a consistent basis to maintain your relationship with God. All the time, yes? Even when you go to the bathroom, before you enter the bathroom is a special blessing that you say, hoping that everything will work out. And when you get out, you say, thank you, God, for allowing it to happen, yes, and things like that. Everything is connected directly to the divine, and therefore you can really maintain your relationship with God constantly during all your wake-up hours. Okay? And that is definitely something that moved on and affected the religions in general. Now, the last example that I want to give is a little bit controversial, and I will talk about it much more, but I'll talk about the early stage, and that's the idea of pluralism. Very early in Jewish history, you start to see different branches of Judaism emerging, allowing people to make sort of a choice which branch they are going to belong to. So I'll just give you the example. At the time, around the time that Jesus was preaching, okay, you have the two main branches of Judaism, which were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They are also mentioned in the New Testament. But then you had some esoteric groups, like the group of the Essence, that used to be thought that they are the originators of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find a manuscript that describes another group that called itself the Children of Light, or the Enlightened. Yes, this is much before the Enlightenment, yes, but they called themselves the Children of Light, as opposed to the others who did not see things their way, who were called the Children of Darkness. Yes, so this scroll that was found tells you how to lead your life as a child of enlightenment in order to prepare to the imminent coming of the kingdom of God, of the Messianic era. So, on one hand, then, Judaism introduced to the world the possibility of having many different branches of the same religion and allowing, therefore, people to choose which one they want. And as a matter of fact, the early Christianity was really a branch of Judaism. Jesus was a Jew who was preaching and created a church that eventually followed his beliefs and his ideas. This as a church was established in Jerusalem and was made by good Jews who also followed the commandments of Judaism. And they at the beginning even had problems with pagans who converted to Christianity, because the pagans who converted to Christianity said, we converted to Christianity, we did not convert to Judaism, we don't have to follow this. So there was a great friction between the two. Okay? I'm a bit hesitant to bring this because, as a matter of fact, Judaism, while it shows this kind of pluralism, also demonstrated in some cases a lack of tolerance, which, you know, very natural for people to believe in something and therefore to say, I am sure that I'm right, and therefore if you don't think like me, you must be wrong. Yes? And as long as we say it politely that it's not so bad, but sometimes it leads to all sorts of antagonistic and friction. And unfortunately, that is also something that we saw among different Jewish branches at early stage, as we see sometimes today, where some of the Jewish branches refuse to acknowledge that the other Jewish branches are part of Judaism. And we see that in Christianity, with the different branches in Christianity, not only Catholics and Protestants, but the Protestants are divided into 1,000,001 different churches. And we see it in Islam, the Shiite and the Sunni and the other, I don't even know all the names, but you see it exactly the same. That is an area where all of humanity has to work much harder upon. That's basically what I wanted to tell you. So that takes us around the end of the biblical time and around the time of Jesus, the beginning of the era, and I can continue from here on the further forward.
Okay. Most of you know Ira, but you may not have known what he did with his life professionally for 33 years. He was a neurophysiologist at Children's Hospital. But in the last, God knows how many months, say, he's been involved very much in Arab-Jewish dialogue. He was a co-founder of Project Encounter, which brought Palestinian and Israeli high school students to Spain for summer programs. And he now frequently teaches workshops about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I was honored to take one on parallel narratives and how they never meet, like parallel lines. So very sobering and very informative. If you get the chance to take it, please do.
So I will pretty much continue the history of Jewish pluralism or Jewish diversity from where Gideon left off. I want to introduce it, though, by first saying that Jews identify themselves more as a people than as a group that shares a common faith. No one who does not believe in God calls himself a Christian. But lots of people who do not believe in God call themselves Jewish. And that is probably part of what accounts for the diversity of beliefs and practices among Jews today. Gideon spoke about pluralism, the Jewish religion and culture till about the time of Jesus, and I'm going to continue from exactly that particular time. After the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem, after the destruction even of the first temple in Jerusalem, the Jewish religion began to evolve from its biblical form of sacrifices primarily and pilgrimages to the temple in Jerusalem to what we know today as Rabbinic Judaism. The Judaism of today is Rabbinic Judaism. After the death of Jesus, theological differences developed between Jesus' followers and other Jews, and eventually the theology of Jesus' followers separated so drastically from its Jewish roots that and I say for all intents and purposes, it became a separate religion. It's called Christianity, definitely became a separate religion. And after that theological split, just after the death of Jesus, in the next 100 or so years, there were really no other major splits, major divisions in the Jewish religion for a few hundred years. In the 9th century, a sect arose that did not accept Talmudic interpretations of the Torah. These are the Karaites. When interpreting the Torah, the Bible, okay, all the books of the Bible, Karaites usually adhere to what they consider the obvious meaning of the text. I won't talk about what the obvious meaning is. We can talk about that later, not necessarily the literal meaning. In contrast, Rabbinic Judaism relies on the rulings codified in the Talmud, rulings of the Sanhedrin actually, codified in the Talmud and in other sources as well, and uses those sources to provide the Orthodox Jew with the authentic meaning of the various sentences and commandments in the Torah. At one time, about 40% of Jews were Karaites. Today, there are very few left. There's about 40,000 Karaites living in Israel. There are about 4,000 here in the United States. There's about 100 families in Istanbul, Turkey, and that's about it. That's about the whole community, 45,000 at most, Karaites left in the world. Most Jews in the United States do not know that Karaites exist. Getting back to the mainstream Rabbinic Judaism placed a great emphasis on education. Learning was seen as the pathway to God. We're coming up now to the 1700s, the 18th century. In the 1700s, a new movement arose in Eastern Europe called Hasidism. It emphasized a more personal experience, and it emphasized mysticism as alternative ways, alternative routes to reach God. Hasidism has many, actually, similarities to Sufi Islam in many ways. There are several Hasidic sects. There are many Hasidic sects. Each one is organized around a spiritual leader called a Rebbe or a Tzaddik. And Hasidim typically consult that Rebbe for every major life decision they have to make. That's the culture of the Hasidic sects. The rest of the Jews, I shouldn't say the rest, many Jews strongly opposed Hasidism. They thought of it as a know-nothing religion. It was too emotional and not learned enough for them. And these people were called mitnagdim. So we had opposers. That's what mitnagdim means. And these two movements had a lot of disagreements between them, much as Sufi and Sunni Islam do still. Now today, Hasidim and mitnagdim are relatively unified. They're no longer really in opposition to each other. Very few people any longer call themselves mitnagdim. They're really unified, and what largely they're really unified about is they both equally strongly oppose the liberal divisions of Judaism, which we'll get into right now. They're usually called, as I say, Haredim, which Haredim in general terms, literally it means the tremblers, but what it means is ultra-Orthodox. So now we get to the liberal movements, which the Haredim and Datim in general are equally opposed to. There are about 13 million Jews in the world today, rough numbers. About 6 million live in Israel, about 6 million live in the United States. In other words, over 90% of the Jews today live in only two countries. both of which had relatively few Jews just 2 centuries ago. Relatively few Jews today live in European and Arab countries, which were their homes 2 centuries ago. This massive migration of Jews from Europe and from the Arab world to America and Israel created an upheaval in Jewish civilization that triggered an even more rapid evolution of diversity and pluralism. Now, the kind of diversity and pluralism that evolved in the United States turned out to be very different from what evolved in Israel, so I'll talk about them separately. In the United States, the Jewish religion kind of evolved into I would say 5 major groups at the moment. I'd call it 5. You can argue there's more or less. The Reform movement, the Conservative movement, the Orthodox movement, the Reconstructionist movement, and the Renewal movement. Okay? Protestants would call these sects. Most Jews call them movements. Orthodoxy today consists of several groups, subgroups, if you like, of Orthodoxy. The modern Orthodox have largely integrated into modern society while maintaining pretty strict observance of halakha, of Jewish traditional ritual law. The Hasidim among the Orthodox are different. They live in their own separate communities by and large, and also dress very distinctively. Another group that I would call Yeshiva Orthodox. They're not members of a Hasidic sect, but are also not totally integrated into modern society. In Israel and also in the United States, people will refer to both of those, that is to say the Hasidim and the non-Hasidic Yeshiva Orthodox, as black hats, primarily because one way or another their hat's going to be black. Now, all the Orthodox movements hold that God gave Moses the whole Torah at Mount Sinai. The whole Torah includes the written Torah, the Bible, and the oral Torah, the Talmud, and all the other oral traditions that interpret and explain the written Torah. Orthodoxy holds that the Torah is literally true and that Jews are obligated to observe all 613 commandments, 613 mitzvot, which means commandments, that it contains. As of about 15 years ago, I have only old figures for this, about 10% of American Jews considered themselves Orthodox. About 10%. It's actually a little different today. We'll talk about that later. Reform Judaism does not believe that the Torah was written by God. They believe it was written by people. It's an historic document. Reform Jews do not believe, therefore, in mandatory observance of the non-universal ritual Torah commandments, like keeping kosher, or not lighting a fire on Shabbat, or praying 3 times a day. They stress the universal ethical and moral values of Judaism that are found in the Torah, and are also found in the books of the prophets, which is part of the Bible in general. And again, this is several years ago, about 35% of American Jews identified themselves as Reform. Conservative Judaism, the conservative movement, historically evolved out of Orthodoxy. It evolved out of an Orthodox seminary, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, in the 1880s. Began to evolve in the 1880s, I should say. Conservative Jews hold that the truths found in Jewish scripture and other Jewish writings come from God ultimately, originally, but were transmitted by humans and contain human components. In other words, the Bible contains human components in addition to God's commandments. Conservative Judaism generally accepts the binding nature of halakha, but interprets halakha in a way that takes modern life into more consideration than does Orthodoxy. For example, Orthodox Judaism forbids the use of a car on Shabbat no matter what. Conservative movement officially allows the use of a car on Shabbat only for very certain purposes. For example, you're permitted to use a car if that's the only way you can get to synagogue on Shabbat. We can get to the reasons for this. There are reasons for all of these rulings, but this is the conservative position. Reconstructionist Judaism understands Judaism not as a fixed set of laws, but as an evolving religious civilization. Reconstructionism puts a bigger emphasis on ritual observance than Reforms do, but not because it holds that those rituals are God's commandments. It puts the emphasis on ritual because it believes that those rituals are a valuable part of the culture of Jewish civilization, and that the rituals lend meaning to Jewish life and are also important to preserve for their own sake, for the sake of the civilization. There is now a renewal, shouldn't say now, it's been around for a while, the renewal movement, the fifth one, the renewal movement in Judaism has its origins in the 1950s and 1960s. All these movements, with the technical exception of reform, originated in America, every one of them. And even the reform movement, as we know it, really largely comes out of America, although it began in Germany. The renewal movement began in the 1950s and 1960s. Probably its best-known proponents are Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Michael Lerner, and Arthur Waskow. Some of you may have heard of these people. Renewal puts an emphasis on the direct spiritual experience. It's a grassroots, trans-denominational approach to Judaism that incorporates into Jewish practices the moral lessons of feminism, for example, the joy of Hasidism, the social dynamism of the Chabura movement, which we can talk about later, which is a movement of people praying together in small groups and forming small groups rather than building large synagogues. Renewal worship also often includes music, meditation, chant, yoga, storytelling. In the words of one of its proponents, renewal strives to imbue Judaism with an ecumenical, egalitarian, and post-triumphalist sensibility to create innovative, accessible, and welcoming worship to shape halakha into a living way of walking righteously. Another 6 million Jews live in Israel. Orthodoxy is the only movement that's technically, formally, legally recognized in Israel. Until very recently, only Orthodox Jews served on religious councils in Israel. The Orthodox rabbinate in Israel controls matters of personal status, like marriage, conversion, and divorce. The other American movements exist in Israel, but in small numbers, with small numbers of adherents. And unlike American Jews, Israeli Jews usually do not identify themselves with a movement. Rather, they identify themselves by the degree to which they observe traditional Jewish Orthodox law. Most Israelis describe themselves as secular, or as traditional, or as observant. They don't describe themselves as members or adherents of Orthodox, conservative, or Reform movements. More than half of all Israelis describe themselves as chiloni, secular. About 15 to 20% describe themselves as dati, religious, or charedi, ultra-religious, and the rest describe themselves as masorti, traditional. Probably the best expression of this difference between American and Israeli Jews is the fact that most Israeli Jews say something like, they will say something like, Israelis don't go to synagogue, but the synagogue they don't go to is the Orthodox synagogue. It's actually a very good description. There's only one synagogue you don't go to. While there's less theological diversity among Israeli Jews, there's greater cultural diversity. The Jews who ended up in the United States came overwhelmingly from Middle and Eastern Europe. A very large fraction of the Jews who ended up in Israel came from the Arab world, and small numbers from Ethiopia, Western Europe, and non-Arab countries in Asia. Each of these groups of Jews had developed over the centuries its own traditions of prayer and ritual observance and its own culture. Its own language, foods, music, dance, and social mores. 100 years ago, Jews were much more scattered around the world. There they evolved these different cultures. Ashkenazi Jewish culture developed among the Jews of Eastern Europe. These Jews spoke Yiddish. Their mother tongue was Yiddish. Ashkenazim brought klezmer music to the United States, as well as pastrami, knishes, bagels, and gefilte fish, the stuff that Americans think of as Jewish. Mizrahi Jewish culture developed among the Jews of Arab countries. Mizrahi means Eastern. It's really Arab Jews. They spoke Judeo-Arabic, not Yiddish. Their music sounds very much like Arab music, and their typical foods are variations on the dishes of the Arab countries that today we're all familiar with. In 1492, Jews and Muslims were expelled from Spain. And that's the origin of Sephardic Jews. Sephardic in Hebrew means Spanish, Spanish Jews. They spoke Judeo-Espanol, also known as Judesmo. Most people call it Ladino. It's not technically the right name. Technically, Ladino is a different language, but that's it's what everyone calls Ladino today. Separate distinctive Jewish cultures also evolved among the Jews of Ethiopia, Greece, Italy, India, China, and a few other places. These are small groups, though. There were more than a dozen different Jewish languages spoken. By some counts, there were 22 Jewish languages spoken in the world. Specifically, Jewish languages spoken by Jews in different countries as their mother tongue. With the recent migration of the overwhelming majority of the world's Jewish population to just 2 countries, the US and Israel, most of those languages are disappearing. At the same time, Hebrew, the language of the Jewish people during biblical times, was revived. This actually is the first known resurrection of a native spoken language in history. 150 years ago, there were no native speakers of Hebrew. Today, there are several million. And that's where I will stop.
I think I can say this as someone who's primarily Ashkenazic. I don't think there's a soul under the age of 70 who prefers Ashkenazic food to Sephardic food. Really, not one. Have you ever had gefilte fish? Anyway, all right, Professor Sahar Khamis is an expert on Arab and Middle Eastern media. She's an assistant professor in the communications department of the University of Maryland and the former head of mass communications and information science department in Qatar University, and also the co-author of Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, which was published in 2009 and which I had the pleasure of reading very recently and really loved it, so I would recommend that book to each of you. We've got copies right here. So I won't say anything more about it because I'm sure Sahar is going to mention the topic a little bit more. So please.
Assalamu alaikum, shalom. Thanks to the Bethesda Jewish congregation for hosting us for this JID session. And the idea of this session really was born at Dan's home when we were talking about planning the JID sessions. And we talked about the importance of bringing to people's attention the non-monolithic nature, if you will, of both these great faith or traditions of Islam and Judaism, how they're not monolithic, uniform, or static in nature, what kind of influences actually bring them to what they are today in terms of not just the religion or the faith, but also the culture, the languages, the history, the geography, all of the complexities that make up what we know today as Islam or Judaism. And I've often struggled with people who just talk about Muslims in one broad category. And I'm like, really? There are 1.6 billion Muslims out there, stretching from countries as far as Indonesia and Malaysia to Algeria and Morocco. How can you put them all in one basket and just give them this one label, Muslims? And I'm sure is the same with, the term Jews. And we've, seen my colleagues here, Gideon and Ira talked about, what the complexity of Judaism and how it really has evolved over time. I am more of a contemporary scholar, and also my field is communication. So I would focus particularly on three particular aspects I think are very important to address in understanding contemporary Islam and Islamic societies today: the cultural influence, the diaspora influence, and the new media influence. So pretty much in the contemporary context. Talking about the cultural influence, I oftentimes hear people saying the word Islamic revival or Islamic resurgence. And they talk about it as one monolithic movement, as if it's just one group of people with one single way of thinking, thought, way of life, which is not true. In fact, there are so many different Islamic resurgence movements with a plural S, and so many different Islamic revival movements also with a plural S, because it depends on whether you are a Salafi, which is a more traditional form of Islam that's, like the Orthodox, is very much about, the scripture and really following all the little, nitty-gritty details of, the practice, sometimes without having the same level of spirituality that other moderate brands of Islam, like Sufism, which is similar to the Hasidic tradition, have emphasis on spirituality, for example. Or are you simply a moderate Muslim who just wants to revisit your own faith and your own religion and come closer to your own identity as a Muslim, and you want more practice in your everyday life? So these are all not to be lumped in one single category, and not to be given one single label as Islamic revival or Islamic resurgence movement, because there are so many different pluralities and so many different distinguished differences and peculiar distinctions between these different trends. We cannot just put them all under one category or one label. But speaking specifically about the cultural influence on Islam and how that has affected what we know today as Islam or Muslims, I would argue that there are so very many different influences that came from the specific political, economic, social structure in different Muslim countries that make up the kind of Islam or the brand of Islam which is being practiced in different Muslim countries and Muslim nations. Two questions I always get asked oftentimes is, question number one, is Islam compatible with democracy? And question number two, is Islam compatible with feminism? These are two questions that always get asked. And they get asked for good reasons, because people look at the situation or look at the status or the contemporary status quo in many Muslim countries, and it's not very pleasing, I must admit. And they look at it and say, okay, so that means that Islam and democracy do not go hand in hand. Islam and feminism cannot go hand in hand. And that, in my opinion, is a grave injustice to Islam itself as a faith. Because what we are seeing today in terms of authoritarianism or dictatorship that prevails in many parts of the Muslim world is very much a product of the historical, cultural, social context in these societies. Many of these societies have suffered from centuries of imperialism and colonialism, very high staggering rates of illiteracy, high rates of poverty, socioeconomic challenges, infrastructural challenges. All of these factors, the complexity of these factors breeds what we call authoritarianism or dictatorship. And then religion becomes used here as a tool. Islam becomes used as a tool to actually make the masses always passive and always defer to the ruling of unjust leaders or rulers. So religion becomes, so-called, quote-unquote, the opium of the masses, in this sense that it just keeps people passive and accepting the unjust rulers, which is really not Islam's fault. We cannot blame Islam for this kind of, very far from ideal political situation, because what happens, as I said, is the product of all of these difficult factors, and then religion becomes added to the mix as a tool of just making the masses defer to or listen to their own unjust leaders or rulers. However, the fact that authoritarianism has nothing to do with Islam itself is very much proven by contemporary examples, like, for example, having a state like Turkey, which is a modern, Muslim state that has now growing democracy. You can also see, of course, the Arab Spring, Arab Awakening movements that have been sweeping many parts of the Arab world, where majority Muslim countries and Muslim women have played a very important, prominent role, which really shows that there is nothing inherently Islamic about authoritarianism or dictatorship whatsoever. There are also rising Muslim countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, where we are seeing now some booming economies and more, prosperous social and cultural life as well. So, as one of the Islamic scholars puts it, and I like his term very much, he says that anyone who claims that Islam is not compatible with democracy is someone who really does not understand Islam or democracy. I like the way he puts it very much, and I think it really kind of, summarizes the whole thing in a nutshell. So I think that that has to be really understood as a way of addressing this very important issue and understanding why in a country like Pakistan, for example, people will choose leaders who are very much against their own interest or do not really do what is in the best interest of the people, because there is some kind of tribal culture. The tribal culture there compels people to vote or to give their voice to someone that their tribe or their family is going to vote for anyway. And I met this Pakistani guy on an aeroplane one time, and he was telling me about, how they elected the wrong prime minister. He was a bad guy, he was a corrupt guy. I said, why did you elect him? He said, there's 90% illiteracy rate. It's a very high illiteracy rate in the country, a lot of tribalism. And when you have this is very much social climate that would lead to authoritarianism and dictatorship, but it has nothing to do with Islam. In fact, the Muslim tradition or the Muslim faith itself, dating back to the time of Prophet Muhammad, the peace and blessings of God be upon him, had the principle of shura. And shura means consultation. And consultation was very much at the heart of Islamic tradition, where the Prophet has always given a chance for his disciples and his followers to consult and to talk and to negotiate and to deliberate. Especially when it came to everyday life and everyday matters, he always gave them a chance to voice their own opinions and to consult together and to deliberate. And there was nothing coercive or nothing really forcing them to him. He did not say, like, I am the messenger of God, you have to just do whatever I tell you. He always gave them room to deliberate and to talk and to discuss and to exchange views, which means that this whole notion of compatibility of Islam and democracy, in my opinion, is very important to understand and to put in the right context without doing some injustice to Islam itself as a faith or as a tradition. The second question, which is Islam compatible with feminism? Again, that's another question that gets asked quite a lot, and it gets asked because people look at the condition of women in the Muslim world, and they say, oh my God, so it must be Islam that is really, forcing women to, wear these very comprehensive black veils. Nothing can show except their eyes. They cannot work. They cannot drive cars. They're just, confined to the domestic sphere. They're poorly treated. And of course, here again, I would like to address the notion of the complexity of Muslim societies and the cultural, social, political influences that kind of, brought about some of these far from ideal conditions or situations that are, involving Muslim women today. And I'll give some concrete examples. For example, the tradition of female circumcision. This is a tradition that does not really have its roots in Islam as much as it has its roots in the culture of some African nations, which explains why, for example, in Muslim countries in Africa, like Sudan and Egypt, this tradition is being practiced, while in some of the Muslim countries in Asia, including some of the most traditional conservative Muslim countries, like Saudi Arabia or some of the Gulf countries, you do not see this tradition being practiced whatsoever. Why is that the case? Because its roots are not Islamic. Its roots are cultural, specifically from an African background. The same thing with honor killings. Honor killings are completely, totally non-Islamic tradition. They don't have any kind of roots in Islam whatsoever. In fact, honor killings, that's a crime against women. That's violence against women that is not to be tolerated under the Muslim faith whatsoever. When Islam first came, the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, they had the very bad tradition of burying the baby girl. So if someone had a baby girl, they would be so ashamed. They would consider it a big shame to have a baby girl, and they would just bury her in the sand. And the Quran greatly condemned this act. Condemned it as a very bad act. How can you possibly bury, the gift that God has given you, the spirit that God has given you, this daughter or this girl of yours, and consider this to be a terrible crime against women? So Islam really reversed the very negative and degrading, status of women in many parts of the world, and turned it into a much, much better status as mothers, to be respected and as equal partners in the social sphere. So if that is the case, then the next question becomes, then how come the far from ideal situation that Muslim women are in today in many parts of the world is existing, and why is this the case? Here again, I would argue that this is because of the culture. Many parts of this, the Arab world, the Muslim world, has a tribal culture, traditional culture. Countries like the Gulf or Saudi Arabia or other Gulf states, women dress in a certain black garment that is not necessarily ordained or prescribed in religion. Religion, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, emphasizes modesty, that modesty is an important part of a religious woman's life, but it did not specify this particular type of dress to be worn uniformly. And the proof of that is that you see other types of dress, for example, in Pakistan, in Malaysia, in Iran, in other parts of the Muslim world, women dress in many different ways, in many different shades and colors. Some of them are dressed fashionably, some of them are dressed, even not veiled. There are so many different forms of dress that prevail in these societies, not just one single uniform type of dress. This has been very much an influence of culture, of tribalism, of traditional thought and practice in these societies. Some of the rights that were granted to women, as for example, the right of the woman to divorce herself from her husband, to ask to be his only wife, that he does not take any other wife but her, the right to her inheritance, to economic partnership, to have her own economic business and her own money for herself without any interference from her male relatives. Some of these are very progressive rights that were granted to women that are not even present in some of the modern, contemporary, even Western societies in some cases. However, unfortunately, there has been a neglect of women informing Muslim women about these rights. A lot of Muslim women do not know about these rights. They don't know that these rights actually exist, and therefore they don't really call for them, which is a big shame, of course. I always argue it's very important to have a generation of well-informed, well-educated Muslim women who are able to understand their own religion, and therefore be able to call for their own rights and fight for their own rights. And that really takes me to a very, very important point, which is neglecting the principle of ijtihad. Ijtihad means free, independent thinking and free interpretation of the religious text. I argue that the turning point or the key point in Islamic history between the age of Renaissance and Islamic civilization, when Muslims were really at the peak of their own achievement, not just in religious knowledge, but even in secular knowledge, in astronomy, in biology, in physics, in chemistry, in all different fields of knowledge, was when the principle of ijtihad or free and independent thinking was safeguarded. When Muslims neglected this principle of ijtihad, it is, in my opinion, like switching off the mind. It's like you're putting your mind on hold or on pause. You're not allowed to think, you're not allowed to be creative, you do not question the text, you do not question the scripture, you do not ask questions, and that's when some kind of stagnation actually came about, and that involved every aspect of life, politically, socially, economically. The ijtihad principle was neglected, and therefore we started a new era of stagnation and even backwardness in many Muslim societies, which led one Muslim convert to tell me it's amazing how Islam has been spreading for the last few centuries despite the Muslims, or despite the condition of Muslim societies. And he is right, because there is a big gap between the beauty of the religion itself and all its great teachings and some of the negative practices that have been unfairly and unjustly attributed to Islam. The second point I want to talk about is the diaspora. And of course, many Muslims today live in Western societies, non-Muslim societies, and that leads to some form of inoculation or cross-fertilization of ideas between Muslims and non-Muslims, which opens the door for many opportunities, but also invites many challenges as well. Some of the opportunities, of course, is the ability to redefine and re-understand Muslim identity in a different context. The globalization and internationalization of the faith means that we're able to have interfaith dialogue, just like this event. We're able to be together in this place, talk and discuss and exchange thoughts and ideas, which is a great opportunity in and of itself. The challenges, of course, becomes accepting the other and being accepted by the other, right? It's a very, very important thing to think about, that it's true that not in every Muslim society Muslims are equally accepted, and sometimes they face challenges, like for example the issue of the hijab in France, banning the women from wearing the hijab or the headscarf. There have been some issues here in America, where women went to court, they had to go to court to fight for the right to put on the headscarf, and so there are some issues of acceptance. How much would you be accepted, as the other with a capital O, and how much are you as a Muslim also willing to accept the other at the same time, which I'm sure Imam Bashar will talk about a lot in his own presentation as well. 9/11, of course, has been a very, very important turning point. It did, in my opinion, act as a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought about Muslims in the center of attention for all the wrong reasons, attributing things like violence and extremism and terrorism to Islam and Muslims. But on the other hand, surprisingly enough, it did have its positive and good sides, because so many people started to ask, what is Islam? Who are the Muslims, right? We want to know about Islam. And they started to read about the faith, and even centers of Middle Eastern studies and centers of Islamic studies started to open in some of the Western societies here in the US and in Europe. Many, many centers and universities started to invite scholars like myself and others to lecture and to talk about Islam and about the Arab world in an unprecedented way. So it was really a double-edged sword. But there is definitely a lot of work that needs to be done in order to make the best out of this diasporic existence of Islam and Muslims, and to minimize some of the negative challenges, including Islamophobia and the exclusion of Muslims and Muslims' exclusion of others. That needs more work to be done. And my final and last point is the digital dialogue, or the new media, which is really my area of specialization. So the new media, or now the existence of the internet as a very important medium that many, many young people are spending time on. Muslims are no exception. In fact, you would be amazed to know that 70% of the population now in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, are young people under the age of 30, right? Which means these are people who are always on the internet most of the time. They're chatting, they're texting, they're posting, they're tweeting, and that opens the door for a new type of understanding of Islam. I always tell my students this is like a window that allows Muslims to see the rest of the world, and also allows the rest of the world to better see Muslims. Right? So you think of it as a two-way street or a two-way process. You see the rest of the world, and the rest of the world also sees you. In this book, Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, I do talk about some of these issues related to digital dialogue, and how there have been some opportunities now to redefine Islamic societies and to open new public spheres of discussion and dialogue with the other, which has been a good opportunity in some ways. But it also invited many, many challenges as well, in terms of the degree to which there could be acceptance, reconciliation, coexistence. Some of the forums on some of the discussion boards I have studied in this book, for example, were shocking in terms of the degree of intolerance of the other. Not all of the chances to have digital dialogue always lead to positive deliberation or positive exchange of knowledge. Unfortunately, some of them do, but many of them don't. And there are reasons for that. Some of the reasons could be the absence of the role of the ulama or the religious scholars, which I'm sure Imam Bashar will talk about as well. The religious scholars are not equally equipped or invited to take part in these religious discourses. Many cases, some people do not have the right knowledge to really have a constructive, positive dialogue through the internet with others, or simply they hide behind the curtain of anonymity and they start to engage in all types of hate speech against the other and to vent negative feelings and emotions. So just like everything else, the internet did open the door for both positive and negative aspects in terms of the relationship of Islam and Muslims with the rest of the world. And I would very much welcome your any discussion, of course, and answering any questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
So I have two faiths. I'm a Jew. That's my main faith, and my other faith is football. So I have to introduce our final speaker with that in mind. Imam Mohammed Bashar Arafat is a rookie when it comes to jids. But when it comes to interfaith relations in this area, he is most definitely a Hall of Famer. He is the president of the Islamic Affairs Council of Maryland and the Civilizations Exchange and Cooperation Foundation. He was born and raised in Damascus, Syria. He's the founder of the An-Nur Institute for Islamic Studies and Arabic Language in Baltimore, and he's a former campus imam at Johns Hopkins University. We hope we will see you on a regular basis like these other speakers, because you have so much to offer the JIDS community. So here you go.
It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation and to share with my colleagues to talk about this important topic, which I hope that we will have a chance in other places to talk about that, because this is really so much needed today to talk about it. I would like to use my few minutes to talk about three things. First one is the curriculums of the Sharia schools around the world today, and also the imams in America, as well as the clergy in the United States, and what they can offer to the same topic we are talking about to believers around the world. And the last thing is a spiritual dimension of cultural pluralism. Before I just say anything, I just would like to say that I was listening to the reform and the evolution of Judaism and the sons of Israel as they were mentioned in the Quran. And I just would like to say something. I was not planning to add it here, that we have to separate between two things, Islam and the Quran. And I don't think a lot of people talk about these two issues. The word Islam means to submit your will and your heart and your faith to Almighty God. And based on that, the Quran says that Adam and Eve and all the prophets, Idris, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, were all Muslims. And also the 24 prophets, as well as the 25th Prophet Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. So all of them, they were Muslims. They submitted their will to Almighty. The Quran was revealed on Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the son of Abdullah, in Arabia, and preached to the community how Moses received the Torah and how later on the followers of Moses, the next generations, opposed Jesus, and what happened really. So the Quran brought the discussion to exactly what happened, and told the Muslims that, or told the community of Prophet Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, not to repeat the mistakes of those before you, in order to be true believers to Almighty. So look what happened here, and look what the followers have done. Look what happened to that prophet, and look how the followers have misinterpreted. So that's where you will see a lot of similarities between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, which is the house of Abraham. Again, I wish I have more time to talk about that. But this is really interesting to underline, because it brings a lot of unity today. And the other thing I would like to add it as an introduction is the concept of al-aql, as it is mentioned in the Quran, or the mind or the intellect, and the intellectual power that the Quran says, regardless when you are born, whether you were born during the time of Prophet Muhammad or before or after, you have to use your brain, and you have to use your mind, and you have to find God yourself, the same way others have done. Now, most of the people, the majority, they follow what their parents have told them to do, which is fine. But the Quran is saying, still, after the age of puberty, you are responsible for your own decisions and your own making. So that's why we are told about Abraham a lot, and how he started his journey of faith to find God. Once you find God, then we have the legislations, whether it is the Torah, or how the Quran also reformed certain things brought by the followers of Moses during the time of Prophet Muhammad in Medina. And that's the constant debate about those topics. The thing which I would like to talk about really is which is kind of related to the issue of the intellectual importance in Islam, and that is to recognize by your mind that things change. So during the time of Prophet Muhammad, things changed. And the whole issue was how much you can accept the change. Of course, the teachings of monotheism was so clear in Mecca. But when Prophet Muhammad migrated to Medina, and now things are, mostly stable, things started to change, and the Quran started, revealing verses talking about changing some of the cultural behavior. And in one instances, Prophet Muhammad himself was kind of, how I'm going to tell them that you are not allowed anymore to marry your daughter-in-law. Or I'm talking about the adoption. People used to adopt. And if your adopted son married, okay, and he divorced his wife, this is not your real daughter-in-law, that's the wife of your adopted son, daughter-in-law. So I'm just giving you an example that during the time of Prophet Muhammad in Medina, the people used to consider the adopted son as your biological son. So the Quran wanted to make a distinction that your adopted son, you cannot treat him as exactly like your son. So that was an issue because the adopted son divorced his wife, who was related to Prophet Muhammad. And then Archangel Gabriel came telling the Prophet that you are going to marry the divorced woman of your adopted son, to let the people know that your adopted son is not like your biological son. My point is this: even the Prophet was finding, a little bit in himself how he is going to break the news. But the Quran was legislating things that the people have to move forward. Another example, the Prophet will tell his disciples, do this. And then each one will do it based on his or her understanding. And then they will come to the Prophet, each one did it differently, and he will approve both. Because both they based their decision on using their intellect, and each one came up with a different answer. That shows me, in America, that things change and I have to do things based on my time today. How many of you have used Google to come here today, now? You used Google? I'm sorry, I mean Google and GPS, right? How many of you used GPS to come here? So, several. Now, and how many of you Googled, some of us, or Googled about this event to find information about the speaker here or a speaker there? You used Google and you search about it. This is the culture of today. Now, how you introduce